Hello, my name is Gus Petruski, and today I will be doing a CES Client Assessment. So to give some overview of the client, he is a 21-year-old male with a background in wrestling. He spent 4 years wrestling in high school with one additional year wrestling in college, but he no longer participates in any sport activities, but he does regularly lift weights and has no previous signs of injuries or surgeries. When doing any static assessment or dynamic assessment, there are 5 different kinetic checkpoints that you want to look for on the body. So you want to start at the feet and the ankle, and then work your way up to the knees, into the lumbopelvic hip complex, or the LPHC, following next the shoulders and thoracic spine, and lastly the head and cervical spine. So these are just the important checkpoints that you want to look out for when you're doing the assessments. So I'll begin the client assessment from the static postural assessment. Posture is an observable assessment of how the client puts their body in various positions, and it can be observed both statically and dynamically. Static posture assessments are usually the first step in finding muscular imbalances. So we'll begin from the anterior view, and when looking from the anterior view, there are many common compensations that go along with this. So beginning at the foot and ankle, one common compensation is that the feet may turn out, and working our way into the knees, you may notice knee valgus, which is inward knees, or knee verum, which is outward knees. And working our way into the LPHC, you may notice an asymmetric weight shift. And in the shoulders and thoracic spine, you may notice a scapular elevation. However, in the head and cervical spine, there's not much to notice from the anterior view. So when assessing my client specifically, I noticed that in their ankles they have slight turning out in their feet, and when I look at their shoulders, I notice that there may be slight elevation in the left shoulder when compared to the right shoulder. When looking at the foot and ankle, if his feet are turned out, there may be overactivity or shortened muscles such as the short head of the biceps femoris and the lateral head of the gastrocnemius, as well as the soleus, and underactive or lengthened muscles such as the anterior tibialis, the medial head of the gastrocnemius, the gluteus maximus, the gluteus medius, the medial portion of the hamstrings complex, and the posterior tibialis. I wouldn't say that the client has too much knee varus, but when compared to inward knees, I would say that his knees are slightly knocked outward, and if this is the case, he may have overactivity or shortened posterior fibers of the adductor magnus, anterior tibialis, the long head of the biceps femoris, the piriformis, the posterior tibialis, and the tensor fasciae latae, with underactive or lengthened muscles such as the adductor complex, the gluteus maximus, and the hamstrings complex. And to look at the scapular elevation on his left side, this may be contributed to overactive or shortened levator scapula, pectoralis minor or upper trapezius, or an underactive/lengthened lower trapezius or serratus anterior. Next, I will assess my client from the posterior view of the static postural assessment. So some of the common compensations that can be seen from this view are excessive pronation in the feet and ankles, as well as scapular elevation in the shoulders and thoracic spine. When assessing my client at the feet and ankles, I do notice that there is slight pronation in the feet and ankles, which can be contributed to overactivity or shortened peroneal muscles of the fibularis complex, the lateral head of the gastrocnemius, and the tensor fasciae latae, and the underactive or lengthened muscles can be the anterior tibialis, the medial head of the gastrocnemius, gluteus maximus and medius, the intrinsic foot muscles, and the posterior tibialis. When working my way up into the shoulders and thoracic spine of my client, oddly enough, I noticed that on the anterior side, it appeared that the right shoulder was slightly depressed when compared to the elevated shoulder of the left, but when assessing my client from the posterior view, they seem to be slightly more neutral, and in fact it appears that the left shoulder seems to be more depressed when compared to the elevation in the right shoulder, and this can be contributed to overactivity or shortened muscles such as the levator scapula, the pectoralis minor, and the upper trapezius, as well as underactive or lengthened muscles such as the lower trapezius and the serratus anterior. So next I will move into the static postural assessment from the lateral view, and some common compensations that can be found from the lateral view is that the heels may rise at the feet and ankles, and you may notice a interdependence in knee dominance. Moving our way into the LPHC, you may notice an excessive anterior pelvic tilt or an excessive posterior pelvic tilt, as well as an excessive forward trunk lean. And moving our way into the shoulders and thoracic spine, you may notice that their arms fall forward rather to the side, and at the head and cervical spine, you may notice an excessive cervical extension, which is known as a forward head carriage. So when assessing my client beginning at the feet and ankles, I do not notice that their heels rise at all, and looking at their knees, I don't notice any interdependence in knee dominance. Working our way into the LPHC, I don't notice either anterior pelvic tilt or posterior pelvic tilt, and I don't notice that there's an excessive forward trunk lean as well. Working our way into the shoulders and thoracic spine, I do notice that his arms fall forward rather to the side, and this could be caused from overactivity or shortened muscles such as the latissimus dorsi, pectoralis major, pectoralis minor, and the teres major, and underactive or lengthened muscles such as the infraspinatus, the lower trapezius, the middle trapezius, the posterior deltoids, the rhomboids, and the teres minor. And I do notice that there is slight accession in cervical extension, so there is slight forward head carriage when comparing it to the position of where the shoulders are and the knees in a straight line. And this could be caused from overactivity to shorten cervical extensors, levator scapulae, sternocleidomastoid, and the upper trapezius, as well as underactive or lengthened muscles such as the deep cervical flexors, the lower trapezius, the middle trapezius, and the rhomboids. So next I'll move my way into the overhead squat assessment from the anterior view, and this is going to be our first assessment of the dynamic posture category. So from the dynamic postures, you'll be able to notice some of the same imbalances that occurred from the static postural assessments, but you're also going to be able to notice other imbalances that don't appear unless the client is put under a specific movement pattern. So understanding the proper alignment and movement strategies will allow us to identify the abnormal compensations and find muscular imbalances. And more specifically, the overhead squat assessment falls under the category of the transitional movement assessments, and these are the foundation of movement assessment processes that will involve movement without changing any base of support. And so this will allow movements for the client to focus on their dynamic posture, quality of control of the movements, alignment of their joints during the specific movement patterns, and the overhead squat is specifically designed for assessing someone's dynamic posture, mobility, core stability, and neuromuscular controlling of the body while performing a squat with arms above the head. So some of the common compensations that can be found when looking at the overhead squat assessment from the anterior view specifically are that the feet may turn out, and at the knees you may notice valgus or varus, and at the LPHC you may notice an asymmetric weight shift as well as scapular elevation in the shoulders and thoracic spine. So when I play the video of my client, you will notice some of these imbalances, and I will elaborate on them at the conclusion of the video. Do one more. Do one more. So from this video, I noticed that at their feet and ankles, their feet do turn out, which could be caused in overactivity or shortened muscles of the short head of the biceps femoris or the lateral head of the gastrocnemius, as well as the soleus. And it could be contributed to underactive or lengthened muscles such as the anterior tibialis, the medial head of the gastrocnemius, the gluteus maximus, the gluteus medius, the medial portion of the hamstrings complex, and the posterior tibialis. When working my way up to the knees, I don't notice that the knees go inward, so I wouldn't say knee valgus, but they do appear to push outward a slight bit. So for that, I would say that there may be overactivity, shortness in the posterior fibers of the adductor magnus, the anterior tibialis, the long head of the biceps femoris, the piriformis, the posterior tibialis, and the tensor fasciae latae. And there may be underactivity or lengthened muscles such as the adductor complex, the gluteus maximus, the medial portion of the hamstrings complex. When working my way up to the LPHC, I do also notice that there might be an asymmetric weight shift towards the right side of his body, which can be contributed to overactivity or short muscles such as the adductor complex or the tensor fasciae latae, and underactivity or lengthened muscles such as the core stabilizers. And lastly, when working my way up into the shoulders and thoracic spine, I do notice that there is scapular elevation in the right shoulder, so this could be contributed by overactivity or short muscles such as the levator scapula, the pectoralis minor, and the upper trapezius, or underactive and lengthened muscles such as the lower trapezius and the serratus anterior. Next, I'll work my way into the overhead squat assessment from the posterior view. So some of the common compensations that can be found in the posterior view, beginning at the feet and ankles, are that there may be excessive pronation, and at the LPHC you may notice an asymmetric weight shift, while at the shoulders and thoracic spine you may notice scapular elevation. So I'm going to play the video of my client and then give a breakdown following it. So from this video, I noticed that at the ankles there is slight pronation, so this could be contributed to overactivity or shortened peroneal muscles of the fibularis complex and the lateral head of the gastrocnemius, as well as the tensor fasciae latae, or underactive or lengthened muscles such as the anterior tibialis, the medial side of the gastrocnemius, the gluteus maximus, the gluteus medius, the intrinsic foot muscles, and the posterior tibialis. And when looking at the LPHC, I do notice that there is still an asymmetric weight shift towards the right side of the body, which can be contributed to overactive or shortened muscles such as the adductor complex or the tensor fasciae latae, or underactive and lengthened muscles such as the core stabilizers, or even the gluteus medius. When looking at the shoulders and thoracic spine, I also notice that there is scapular elevation in the right shoulder, which could be caused by anterior overactive or short muscles such as the levator scapula, the pectoralis minor, and the upper trapezius, as well as underactive or lengthened muscles such as the lower trapezius and the serratus anterior. Next, I will begin assessing my client for the overhead squat in the lateral view. So some of the common compensations that you will find in the lateral view are that the heels will rise, and at the knees you may notice knee dominance, and you may notice an asymmetric weight shift at the LPHC, or an excessive anterior pelvic tilt or So next I had my client perform the overhead squat assessment in a modified version. So this modified version is a regression where we place his heels on an elevated surface to eliminate some of the stress that is found in the ankles when performing the overhead squat. So this will help us see if the issues. So to continue, we will assess the client in the modified overhead squat from the. Next, I will work my way. So now I'm going to assess the right single leg squat from the lateral view. And from the lateral view, some of the compensations that may be noticed are that the heels may rise at the feet and the ankles, and at the knee you may notice that there is knee dominance. When we look at the LPHC, you may notice that there's an excessive anterior pelvic tilt or an excessive posterior pelvic tilt, as well as an excessive forward trunk lean. And looking at the shoulders and the thoracic spine, you may notice that their arms fall forward, and at the head and cervical spine, you may notice excessive cervical extension, which is known as the forward. I'm going to play the videos now, and then I will make my critiques afterwards.
That's all right.
So right away from these videos, I noticed that when he enters the squat, his right heel begins to raise off the floor, and this may be caused by overactivity or shortened quadriceps complex, as well as a soleus, or an underactive or lengthened anterior tibialis or gluteus maximus. When we look at the knees, it's hard to tell whether there is knee dominance by only looking at the one leg, but if we compare the right leg to the left leg, later on we may notice that there is knee dominance in one of the legs. But given that this individual is right hand dominant, there may be dominance in the right knee as well. So if that is the case, there may be overactivity or shortened adductor magnus or piriformis, quadriceps complex or soleus, as well as underactivity or lengthened core stabilizers and gluteus maximus. When we work our way into the LPHC, we notice that there is a slight excessive anterior pelvic tilt, which can be known to be caused by overactive or shortened anterior fibers of the adductor complex, latissimus dorsi, psoas, rectus femoris, and the spinal extensor complex, and the tensor fasciae latae. And the underactive or lengthened muscles may be the external obliques, the gluteus maximus, the hamstrings complex, the local core stabilizers, and the rectus abdominis. We also notice in the LPHC from the lateral view that there's an excessive forward trunk lean, and that might be caused to overactivity or shortened muscles of the anterior fibers of the adductor complex, the external obliques, the gastrocnemius, the psoas, the rectus abdominis, the rectus femoris, the soleus, and the tensor fasciae latae. And when looking at the underactive and lengthened muscles, it will be the anterior tibialis, the gluteus maximus, hamstrings complex, local core stabilizers, and the spinal extensor complex. And when we look at the shoulders and thoracic spine, we notice that their arms do fall forward in an attempt to try and balance them. However, in this test, the arms should have been placed on the hips. However, I forgot to inform the client to do so. So maybe in future testing, we will have the client place their hands on their hips to add stability and notice if the arms fall forward from that position, so forth. So for that reason, I will not go over the muscle imbalances. And in the head and cervical spine, we did notice an excessive cervical extension or forward head carriage, and that's going to be caused by overactivity or shortened cervical extensors, levator scapula, sternocleidomastoid, or the upper trapezius, and the underactive or lengthened muscles will be the deep cervical flexors, the lower trapezius, and the middle trapezius, as well as the rhomboids. Next, we'll begin working our way into the left side of the single leg squat assessment. So I will not be going over the common compensations for any of the views, whether it be the anterior, posterior, or lateral. However, I will just play the videos and then get into any of the muscle imbalances that I notice on the left side when compared to the right side of the single leg squat. So when looking at the anterior view, we do notice that the ankle does not actually turn out as much as we saw in the right foot. In fact, it's much more straightforward in comparison. So then when we go into the knees, we notice that the left knee shoots inward when compared to the right knee, so that's going to be knee valgus, not knee varus. And that could be caused by overactivity or shortened adductor complex, short head of the biceps femoris, the gastrocnemius, the soleus, tensor fasciae latae, and the vastus lateralis. And the underactive or lengthened muscles may be the anterior tibialis, the gluteus maximus, the gluteus medius, the hamstrings complex, the posterior tibialis, and the vastus medialis oblique. Moving our way into the LPHC, we do notice that there's an asymmetric weight shift placed towards the side of the body that is being squatted on, so the left, and that's caused by overactivity or shortening of the adductor complex and the tensor fasciae latae, and underactivity or lengthening of the core stabilizers in the gluteus medius. So then we're going to work our way into the shoulders and thoracic spine, and here we notice that there is scapular elevation now on the right scapula when compared to the right side we had a scapular elevation on the left side. So that could be caused by overactivity or shortening of the levator scapula, pectoralis minor, and the upper trapezius, as well as underactivity or lengthening of the lower trapezius and the serratus anterior. So what we can see already on the anterior view comparing the left side to the right side is a complete shift in the body, placing more emphasis on the side that is being squatted on in order to stabilize the body when lowering into the squat position. And again, I forgot to mention to place the arms on the hips, so they are kind of going all over the place, but we do notice a complete difference on both sides of the bodies, again with the knee valgus rather than the varus. So now we will work our way into the posterior view of the left leg single squat assessment. So we'll play the video and then get into any of the imbalances that are noticed. So when we look at the feet and the ankle, we can see a slight amount of pronation, but it is not too much. In fact, I don't think it is as much as compared to the right side. So then when we move our way up into the LPHC, we still notice that asymmetric weight shift. It seems that he's placing a lot of weight onto the left leg that he's squatting on. However, it appears that his trunk is rotating inward rather than outward this time to support the weight that's being placed down on his body. So that may be caused by overactivity or shortened adductor complex or tensor fasciae latae, as well as underactivity or lengthening in the gluteus maximus and medius and the local core stabilizers. So then when we work our way into the shoulders and thoracic spine, we notice that there's still scapular elevation on the right scapula when compared to the left scapula, and that is completely different than when he was squatting on his right leg. So it seems that the balances have switched sides and are doing the same thing. However, it still seems that his body is rotating more inward on this left leg when compared to on his right leg. It seemed that he was rotating more outward. So now we will get into the final view of the left leg single squat assessment. So these are going to be both of our lateral views here. So let's watch the videos and then get into any of the muscular imbalances. So I noticed that on the left leg single squat assessment, his heels do rise, but they do not rise quite as much as that of the right ankle. So then when we move our way into the knees, we only go over the knee dominance for the lateral view. However, it's hard to tell which one of these knees might be more dominant, as he was struggling to stabilize himself on either leg, that being that he was unbalanced on his descent. But maybe it could be that his left leg has more knee dominance when compared to the right leg because his heels weren't rising off the ground quite as far. But I am not 100% sure about that. So then when we move into the LPHC, we notice that excessive anterior pelvic tilt once again, as well as that excessive forward trunk lean. And when we work our way into the shoulders and thoracic spine, we notice that the arms do fall forward once again in an attempt to carry his balance. However, since the assessment was not done properly, that being that his arms were placed on the side of his hips, we cannot make that statement that his arms fall forward due to that. So when we look at the head and the cervical spine, we also notice that excessive cervical extension, or that forward head carriage. So when comparing the left and the right sides of the single leg squat assessment, both sides are very similar. However, when we look at the inward and the outward rotation of the spine, when we are going on the left leg versus the right leg, that is a big difference, as well as the knee valgus and the knee varus that is noticed from side to side. So next we'll get into the anterior views of the split lunge assessment. So the split lunge assessment is a regression of the single leg squat, or an alternative assessment that can be used for individuals who struggle to perform the single leg squat. So in this case, my client did struggle to perform the single leg squat and should not have continued with the assessment. However, for the sake of the video, we wanted to notice any of the muscular imbalances that came from that test, because he did not receive any pain while doing it. So doing this regression has a lot of the same muscular compensations that are found in the single leg squat assessment. So I'm going to play the videos and then we'll get into any of the muscular imbalances that are noticed.
I'll just do two and then switch.
So when we look at the feet and the ankles on both the right and the left side, we do not notice that the feet turn out in any way. In fact, they stay straight the entire time. And then when we work our way up to the knees, we do notice that both the right and the left knees, when being lunged on, have knee valgus. So that means that they are being shot inward, and that can be caused by overactivity or shortening of the adductor complex, the biceps femoris, gastrocnemius, soleus, tensor fasciae lata, or the vastus lateralis, and it could be because of underactivity or lengthening of the anterior tibialis, gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, hamstrings complex, posterior tibialis, and the vastus medialis oblique. And so when we work our way up into the LPHC, we notice that there are asymmetric weight shifts on both the right and the left side. But when we look on the right side, it seems that he's placing his weight still on the right leg. But when we look at the left side, it seems that he might be shifting his weight slightly towards the left, or the right side, I'm sorry. So in both situations, his body has an asymmetric weight shift to the right side, and that could be caused by overactivity or shortening of the adductor complex or the tensor fasciae latae, or it could be because of the biceps femoris, gastrocnemius, and the soleus, or the piriformis. And when looking at the underactive or the lengthened muscles, it could be the core stabilizers, or the gluteus medius, or it could even be the adductor complex in this situation. And when we work our way
I'll just do
into
two and then switch.
further of the LPHC, we can notice that there is an inward trunk rotation and an outward trunk rotation. So when he's on his right leg, it seems that his trunk is rotating more inward, and when he's on his left leg, it seems that it is rotating outward. So in these cases, this could be because of overactivity or shortening of the adductor complex of the tensor fasciae latae, or the adductor magnus, the hamstrings complex, or the piriformis. Or it could be because of underactivity or lengthening of the gluteus maximus, the gluteus medius, the local core stabilizers. And in this case, whether he's on his left or his right side, it seems that both of his shoulders have scapular elevation. So that could be because of overactivity or shortening of the levator scapula, pectoralis minor, or the upper trapezius, as well as underactivity or lengthening of the lower trapezius and serratus anterior. So comparing the left and the right sides of the anterior view of the split lunge assessment, we notice that there are some slight differences, but most of the muscular imbalances are similar and are also of what is found in the single leg squat assessment. However, we notice that the ankles were not turning out in this situation. We'll work our way into the posterior view of the split lunge assessment, so we'll just play the videos and then get into any of the muscular imbalances that are noticed. So looking from the posterior view, we look at the feet and the ankles and notice that there is slight amount of pronation on both the right and the left ankles when being squatted on. And when we work our way into the LPHC, we notice that asymmetric weight shift once again, and this time we get an even better angle of it. So we notice that he was very unstable when lowering into that squat position, and when he was putting pressure on his left leg, he had an asymmetric weight shift towards the center of the body or the middle. And once again, on the right side, it seems that he's placing most of his body weight still towards the right. So whether which leg it be, he is always been leaning more of his body weight towards the right side of the body. So then when we look at the shoulders and thoracic spine, we notice that there is still scapular elevation, but this time we notice that there is a greater deal of scapular elevation on the left scapula when compared to the right in both situations. So now we'll work our way into the split lunge assessment from the left side of the lateral view. So let's go ahead and watch these videos and then get into any of the muscular imbalances. So from this left side of the lateral view, we notice that his left heel remains planted to the floor the entire duration of the split lunge, but on the right ankle, it comes up just a slight amount. So there could be a greater imbalance on the right side when compared to the left. And when we look at the knees from the lateral view, in this situation, we can definitely see that there is dominance in the left knee when compared to the right, and that stems, I think, from the ankle rising off the floor. So then, when we work our way into the LPHC from the lateral view, we notice once again that anterior pelvic tilt, as well as that excessive forward trunk lean. And when we look at the shoulders and the thoracic spine from the lateral view, we notice that those arms fall forward, and when we look at the head and the cervical spine, we notice that excessive cervical extension or that forward head carriage. So these are the same things that we have been noticing almost since the static postural assessment or the overhead squat assessment. They are still being shown in the split lunge assessment. So now we'll get into the final view of the split lunge assessment, this time from the right lateral view, and we'll play the videos and then get into any of the muscular imbalances that are noticed. So right away, what I can tell from this is that the left knee is more dominant than the right knee because he had more difficulty balancing himself on his way down, and his right heel came up once again when compared to that left heel. It remained planted the entire time. So there's definitely some knee dominance there on the left side when placed in that split lunge assessment. And when we look at the LPHC, we notice once again that lateral excessive anterior pelvic tilt, and we'll notice that excessive forward trunk lean. And when we work our way into the shoulders and thoracic spine, we notice that his arms once again do fall forward rather than remaining closer to the side of his body in a neutral position, and that his head and cervical spine, notice an excessive cervical extension or forward head carriage. So these are the same things that we've been seeing almost since the static postural assessment. They're still being shown from the overhead squat until now in the split lunge. So the next assessment I had the client perform is the ankle dorsiflexion test. And the ankle dorsiflexion test is a mobility assessment that does not place emphasis on finding muscular imbalances. However, it is used to confirm some of the muscular imbalances that you have seen from the previous assessments. So if he found difficulty in his ankles or his knees, even up to his hips, this test will show you how much mobility is found in the ankle when placed in dorsiflexion. So I will play the videos now and then talk about what I noticed. So comparing the left to the right side here, we aren't looking for too many compensations. However, we are going to look if that foot is turned out. Once again, it appears that they were straight for this assessment. And when looking at that knee, it does seem that the left knee had an easier time facilitating this test when compared to the right. So we aren't really looking for much else in terms of in the LPHC or in the upper extremities or part of the body. So if anything in the LPHC, we can confirm that there's that anterior pelvic tilt once he starts getting into that dorsiflexion. So the whole point of the dorsiflexion test, as mentioned on the previous slide, is to test how much mobility you have in the ankle when being placed in dorsiflexion. So the way to measure this is to take that foot that is placed on the ground, and once you enter dorsiflexion, you measure the distance that your foot is able to stay flat on the ground while your knee is touching the wall. So at any point in the test, if your heel begins to rise and your knee is not touching the wall, then the test has technically failed and it must be reset until you can complete the test with a flat foot and the knee is touching the wall. So for my client, he was able to perform this test at approximately 2 inches, which was used on my iPhone Measure app. So that's about 5.08 centimeters. And when compared to other individuals with higher levels of ankle mobility, my client has suffered limitations in his ankle mobility. So this could be caused by overactive or shortened quadriceps complex or soleus and underactive or lengthened anterior tibialis and gluteus maximus. So the next assessment I will be having my client perform is the modified Thomas test from the anterior view first. And the modified Thomas test is a hip screening assessment that is used to assess the psoas length of hip extension, the tensor fasciae lata length of hip abduction, and the rectus femoris length of knee flexion. So the modified Thomas test is performed by having the client lie supine at the end of a table with both of their knees bent over the edge of the table. And next, the client will hold their non-testing knee to their chest, putting that hip in a maximally flexed position while their lumbar spine and pelvis remain flat on the table. The test leg is also relaxed on the table. So some of the things that we're going to be looking for, such as compensations, are going to be restricted hip extension, and that's if the test thigh lifts off the table, as well as restricted hip adduction, which is when the test thigh is abducted and not in line with the torso, and restricted knee flexion, which is when the test knee is slightly extended and not exactly at 90 degrees. So we'll watch these videos and then get into any of these compensations that we notice. So as you can see, I provided the anterior views of both the right hip and the left hip being flexed in the modified Thomas test from the anterior view. So in the normal modified Thomas test, what you can see from the anterior view is that the test thigh and hip lay flat on the table in line with the torso without compensation, and the femur rests in a straight line with the torso without compensation, and the knee hangs naturally at 90 degrees off the table edge without compensation. So, what we notice on both the right and the left side here is that there is a restricted hip extension because the test thigh slightly lifted off the table once the hip was flexed, and that could be caused by an overactive psoas or a shortened rectus femoris. And there was also a restricted hip adduction as the test thigh was abducted and not in line with the torso. As you can see there, it is not in a straight line and it's going out to the side or laterally. So that could be caused by an overactive or shortened tensor fascia lata. And in the restricted knee flexion, the test knee was slightly extended and not at 90 degrees. You can see there that the leg hanging off the table is not directly at 90 degrees flat, but it is hard to tell from the anterior view what the exact angle is. However, it does not seem to be 90 degrees, so that could be caused by an overactive or shortened rectus femoris. Now we will get into the modified Thomas test for the right leg only, and we'll be looking at the lateral views this time. And so we'll just play the videos and then get into what we see.
Whichever leg you want.
So once again, from the lateral view, we notice all of those same patterns from the anterior view, that being that the knee
Whichever
is
leg you want.
extended more than 90 degrees, and the thigh slightly lifts off the table once the hip is placed into flexion, and that we can't really tell how far the leg is abducted out to the side from the lateral view, but based off of the anterior view, we can tell that it is abducted to the side there. And lastly, for the modified Thomas test, we'll be looking at the lateral views for the left leg this time. So we'll watch these videos and talk about it. So once again, from the lateral view here on the left leg, we notice the same things from the other lateral view on the right leg and the anterior views, with the extended knee, the thigh lifting off the table, and the abduction to the side rather than being in a straight line. However, it seems that there is less of an extension at the knee there, and the thigh isn't lifting off the table quite as much when compared to the right leg on the lateral view. But it's still hard to tell which leg might be abducted further from the lateral views, and from the anterior views it appeared that they had similar lengths in terms of abduction. Another thing to quickly note is the cervical posture and the lumbar posture. It's slightly hard to tell here with the way his shirt is folded over on the lumbar area, but there could be some curvature there appearing from lower cross syndrome, but it's not certain from this view, and that is not what's being assessed. However, it is something to take a note of, and the cervical flexion, it does seem slightly forward carried. However, he is remaining flat supine on the table, so it's not too much to worry about. The next assessment that was performed with the client is known as the Davies test, and the Davies test is an assessment used to identify movement impairments during a repetitive plyometric activity for the upper extremity. So it requires upper extremity agility, strength, stabilization, and stability of the trunk and LPHC. This assessment can be considered as a performance test, so the number of maximal repetitions during the 15-second testing period should be encouraged, and it should also be recorded. So to begin the Davies test, you will instruct the client to get into a plank position while placing two pieces of tape or in this case, a jump rope while using the iPhone measuring app to measure out 36 inches or 3 feet apart, and that is the length that is used for the arm distances in the plank position. So in order to perform the Davies test, the individual will quickly move their right hand to touch the left hand and then move the left hand to touch the right hand and repeat for 15 seconds. So once the first trial is performed, they will be instructed to perform a second and a third trial as well. So in this case, I have recorded an anterior, lateral, and posterior view. I began the Davies test with the client from the anterior view, though it is noted in the NASM corrective exercise book that the Davies test should be observed from the lateral view. However, it also makes note that you could take an anterior view and still accurately count the repetitions, so I decided to start with the anterior view and also add a posterior view. Though it is not recommended, I thought it would be a unique way to look at different angles of the Davies test. So some of the compensations that you might notice through the Davies test from the lateral view are that the LPHC have an excessive anterior pelvic tilt or an excessive posterior pelvic tilt or an excessive trunk movement, and the shoulders may have scapular elevation or scapular winging, and the cervical spine and head may have excessive cervical extension or have forward head carriage. So we'll just watch this first video and then get into any of these compensations that we might have noticed and count the exact repetitions that he performed on this first assessment. So in this first Davies assessment, the client was able to perform 16 repetitions in 15 seconds. What I am able to notice from this anterior view is that there is some slight scapular winging on both the right and the left, though it looks greater on the right side, and there's some scapular elevation as well. And I also noticed that in the LPHC that there's an excessive anterior pelvic tilt as well as excessive trunk movement while performing the test. And in the head and cervical spine, it does appear that the cervical spine is extended excessively or there's forward head carriage. Next, I had the client perform the Davies test from the posterior view, so we will watch this video and make note of any compensations we noticed. So once again, the client was able to perform exactly 16 repetitions, similar to the first set of the Davies test that he performed, and you can notice that there is an excessive trunk movement during the Davies test here, and that could be contributed by underactive or lengthened local core stabilizers, and there's also that excessive anterior pelvic tilt, which could be attributed by the overactive or shortened adductor complex, latissimus dorsi, psoas, rectus femoris, spinal extensor complex, and the tensor fascia latae, and the underactive or lengthened muscles such as the external obliques, gluteus maximus, hamstrings complex, local core stabilizers, and the rectus abdominis. And looking at the LPHC once again, we do see that excessive forward trunk lean, which could be contributed by overactive or shortened anterior fibers of the adductor complex, the external obliques, gastrocnemius, psoas, rectus abdominis, rectus femoris, soleus, and tensor fascia lata, as well as the underactive or lengthened anterior tibialis, gluteus maximus, hamstrings complex, local core stabilizers, and the spinal extensor complex. And then when we move into the shoulders and the thoracic spine, we notice that there could be some slight scapular elevation due to him holding up his body and stabilizing. It could be placed a higher emphasis than in some of the other assessments that we saw in the video. So that could be because of overactive or shortened levator scapula, pectoralis minor, upper trapezius, and it could also be because of underactive or lengthened lower trapezius or serratus anterior. And getting into something new was the scapular winging. You can also see it on both the left and the right side here when he's performing the Davies test, and that could be because of an overactive or shortened latissimus dorsi, pectoralis minor, or upper trapezius, and an underactive or lengthened lower trapezius, middle trapezius, and the serratus anterior. And when looking at the head and cervical spine, it's hard to tell how far forward it may be carried here, but you do notice that excessive cervical extension, which could be attributed by overactive or shortened cervical extensors, levator scapulae, sternocleidomastoid, or the upper trapezius, as well as underactive or lengthened deep cervical flexors, the lower and middle trapezius, as well as the rhomboids. Lastly, for the Davies test, we'll be looking from the lateral view. So we'll go ahead and play the video and then talk about it. So once again, in all three trials, the client was able to perform 16 repetitions during the Davies test. And the lateral view gives us the best view here of that excessive anterior pelvic tilt at the LPHC, as well as that excessive trunk movement during the testing, as well as the excessive forward trunk lean and the forward head carriage at the cervical spine. And you can tell here as well that the shoulders have elevation in them as they are supporting the body there. Assessment I had the client perform is known as the gait assessment, and the gait assessment is a dynamic postural assessment used to validate any of the prior compensations that we found during the movement testings that were performed in this video. So when we are looking from the anterior view specifically, we are looking at the feet and the ankle to see if the feet turn out, as well as if the knees have valgus or varus, or if there is an excessive asymmetric weight shift at the LPHC. So we're going to play the video now and talk about any of the compensations that come up again.
You're good.
So what I noticed from this video is that his right foot turns out excessively when compared to the left foot. The left foot tended to remain in much more of a straight line, and that could be caused by overactivity or shortened bicep femoris, gastrocnemius, or the soleus, as well as the underactive or lengthened anterior tibialis, or the medial head of the gastrocnemius rather than the lateral, the gluteus maximus and medius, the hamstrings complex, as well as the posterior tibialis. So the other things that we noticed was an asymmetric weight shift slightly more towards his left side, which was the side that had a straighter balance at the feet. And because of that, there may be overactivity or shortened at the adductor complex or the tensor fascia latae, as well as underactivity or lengthening in the core stabilizers or the gluteus medius. Next, I took a look at the gait assessment from the posterior view. So I have two angles, one from a lower point of view and one from a whole body point of view. So looking at the feet and ankle, we are going to check if there's excessive pronation while walking. So we are going to play these videos now and notice if that compensation comes up.
Go. Go.
So looking from this posterior view, we do notice that both the left and the right feet have excessive pronation while walking. So this may be caused by an overactive or shortened peroneal fibularis complex or lateral head of the gastrocnemius as well as the tensor fasciae latae, or underactive or lengthened anterior tibialis medial head of the gastrocnemius, the gluteus maximus and medius, the intrinsic foot muscles, as well as the posterior tibialis. Next, I have the client perform the gait assessment from the lateral view, moving first from the right to the left. And in the lateral view, what I am looking for is in the LPHC is if there is an excessive anterior pelvic tilt or an excessive posterior pelvic tilt while performing the gait assessment. So we will first look at this videos and then comment on what we see.
Okay. Go ahead.
So it appears that when he is remaining in the static postural assessment, here is not too much of an anterior pelvic tilt, but once he gets into the gait motion, we notice that anterior pelvic tilt start to become very excessive. So that could be caused by overactive or shortened anterior fibers of the adductor complex, the latissimus dorsi, the psoas, the rectus femoris, the spinal extensor complex or the tensor fasciae latae, as well as the underactive or lengthened muscles of the external obliques, gluteus maximus, hamstrings complex, local core stabilizers, and the rectus abdominis. Next is the gait assessment from the lateral view moving from the left to the right. So we will watch the video and comment on the compensations that we notice. So once again, the moment that the client begins moving in the gait motion, we notice that anterior pelvic tilt become very excessive when compared to his static postural alignment. That is all that I had for the client assessment. So now I just wanted to get into the end of things and kind of break down what we saw in the videos, beginning with the postural static assessment. The client did not appear to have too many imbalances. His feet appeared to be turned out slightly, as well as some elevation in the scapular region and some forward head carriage. However, once we place the client into some of the movement assessments, beginning with the overhead squat and moving into some of our other movements such as the split lunge, we started to notice some more imbalances such as asymmetric weight shifting and anterior pelvic tilt in the hip complex. We started to notice things in the lower back as well. Lower cross syndrome definitely appeared, as well as upper cross syndrome. He had anterior head carriage and slightly rounded shoulders, and in the lower cross he had definitely a anterior pelvic tilt and curvature in the lumbar spine. And moving down into the legs, from the modified Thomas test, we noticed some limitations in his hip mobility, and on his knees, the flexion is not at the correct angle that it should be at. But those were just some of the major things that I noticed throughout this assessment, and there are not too many imbalances that could not be fixed with some work and effort. beginning with inhibiting, moving into lengthening, integrating, and then finally activating. So with these assessments in mind and the imbalances that he has, an efficient plan can be created to bring him back on track to have less imbalances. So I hope you guys learned something valuable from watching this video. I certainly enjoyed making it, and I had a lot of fun assessing my client and helping him learn a lot of things that he wasn't aware of prior to coming into my assessment. So thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great day.